views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting groups. If you'd like to produce a show, call us at 260-421-1250.
Your host with Carl Fowler as co-host, and joining us today is Ski Wisniewski, a Navy veteran. Before I introduce my guest, Carl would have something he'd like to read.
Good evening. The Korean War Veterans Association, Indiana Chapter Number 1, is looking for a few good members. We hold our meetings the second Saturday of each month at 10 o'clock a.m. at the VFW Post 857. It's located on the hill at the end of West Main Street. If you served in the military anywhere during the Korean War or in Korea anytime after the war, you are eligible. So come on out and join the camaraderie and socialize with other veterans. Spouses and friends are welcome. Lunch is available after the meetings. We participate in parades, have memorial services at the Korean War Memorial on O'Day Road, have Thanksgiving and picnics with the Korean community, but more importantly, we have the Tell America program, which we present to the schools at their request, plus many more activities. For more information, email us at americanveteran@frontier.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
You're welcome.
Our guest today is Harvey, a Navy veteran. Welcome to the show, Harry.
Thank you, Dale.
When was you in the Navy?
I was joined in 1951. The Korean War was breathing down my back, and I had a brother that had been in the Navy, and I thought, I'm going to get drafted into the Army. I tried to find Naval Reserve, but at that time the Korean War was going so hot and heavy, every reserve unit was filled. And so it was a 4-year hitch. I signed up in 1951, January, right after Christmas, and I think about half of the Navy joined at that time because when I arrived at boot camp, Great Lakes was full. San Diego was where they sent me, and we had to stay on a grinder all night long for 2 nights with all the servicemen that arrived there being assigned to new boot camp companies. So 51 to just about January 55. 4 years.
Where'd you take your boot camp at?
San Diego.
San Diego.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I joined right here at the post office in Fort Wayne, and they said Great Lakes is full. Oh. They had quite a crew of us. They got an old Pullman car, and they towed that Pullman car from Fort Wayne clear to San Diego. We got put on sidings and whatnot on our trip to San Diego, but we ultimately made it. So that's where we had boot camp training.
It's funny you said that. It brings back a memory of mine. Is I went from Kalamazoo, Michigan, down to El Paso, Texas, and they did the same thing. They have Pullman cars and they attach them to a train.
Yep.
So you don't have a special train, but that train, like he says, it gets shuttled off on the siding to let coal trains go by. All freight trains and everything have priority over that. So you brought back memories to me. Thank you.
So that was my boot camp years. And well, I was going to turn it over to you. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask, what does boot camp consist of?
Well,
I mean, ski has done a lot of swimming and.
Well, no, in my boot camp, it was just one of the requirements of boot camp was that every Navy man that got out of boot camp had to swim. And I never had that problem. I'd always been a swimmer. But they drilled us with M1 rifles, and we actually had to go do firing range at Camp Elliott outside of San Diego. So we were all required to fire, and we had to learn to wash clothes and by hand scrubbing. In those days, it was all hand scrubbing, and it was just drill. Learn your military drill, and be able to stand at attentions at parades and whatnot. I do remember one interesting thing when we joined. So many of us joined at the same time. This old Navy chief welcomed us. He says, "Welcome, you draft dodgers." And that was us. Yeah, we were all trying to keep out of that Army. So anyhow, we spent about 4 months, 3 months it was, and then I was assigned to the destroyer base in San Diego after boot camp. So ultimately, I was going to talk about my service. After I got out of boot camp, I was at the destroyer base for nearly 4 or 5 months, and then I was assigned to electronics school, and where I got electronics training at San Francisco. And I was on Treasure Island in San Francisco for a 9-month training of electronics, and that was that introduced me at my whole vocation in my life has since been in electronics. Subsequently graduated from Purdue as a double E, so the Navy got me onto that life path.
Got you on the right track, didn't it?
Right, it really did. And then from after the San Francisco Treasure Island training, I was sent to the Naval Supply Center at Oakland, California, and that's where they did supplying of all the military electronic equipment. And we worked on old electronic equipment or equipment that needed to be repaired, brought back to that station and just renovated and fixed and put into service, ready to be assigned to supply. Then I was expecting to go to Korea at any time. Here it was, Korea was going hot and heavy. At that year, there was a Truman extension for most of the military guys of 1 year because that Korean War was still hanging on, and I was just certain I was going to be going to Korea. I kept requesting destroyer duty, and then from the Naval Supply Center I got my orders to finally go overseas. Overseas? Naples, Italy. And what in the world am I going to be doing in Naples, Italy? And of all things, I subsequently got married to a San Francisco girl. Then we went to I went to a base in Washington, D.C., waiting for transportation to Naples, Italy. And I was flown to Naples from West Overfield. First, I went to Lodges Air Force Base in Port Lyautey in North Africa, and then from there to Naples, Italy, where I was assigned to NATO.
You didn't have the privilege of taking the ship and all that.
I didn't. Of all the things, when I was assigned to NATO, it was assigned with Army guys, Air Force, Navy, and even Marines. The Marines always did get their guard duty and that sort of thing. They still always had the same duty they always had. But I was more like I was assigned to an Army group, and the reason they requested our services is because I'd had military, and we were all military. So if we had an Air Force guy, he'd go into military electronics training, and the Army guys all had electronics training. And so we were all electronics guys, and we were assigned because of our electronics training. And I was assigned to a base in Bagnoli, Italy, which was all NATO. And it was more like I was assigned to the Army. I didn't even have to clean my own barracks. We had Italians that were cleaning our barracks, and I thought, what is this? Why do we have guys cleaning? Well, you're in NATO here. We're looked up to. I even met a military fellow that had been in the military during World War II. He says, "Oh, you're from Fort Wayne, Indiana." Well, I was in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was an Italian. I says, "How were you in Fort Wayne, Indiana?" He was a prisoner of war at Camp Scott here in Fort Wayne, of all things. And I remember as a young kid skating on the ice ponds, and the PWs that were scraping the ice. Oh, I scraped that ice in Fort Wayne. So of all things, I ran into him in Bagnoli, Italy. Then we got, from Bagnoli, I was assigned to a group that went to a transmitter site. There were the transmitter receiver sites on the Mediterranean west of Naples, and they were communication sites for NATO. And I was assigned to the transmitter site, and I was with all Army equipment, Army 2.5 tons, Army shells, the Quonset huts, Army military equipment that I had never seen the likes of. And there were several of us Navy guys, and we had to learn all about that. But I do think that the Navy training did really well for us, because most of the Navy guys got to be really our best repairmen and maintenance men of these equipments in our transmitter site. The transmitter site was out in the country on what was previously Italian government land, and there were farmers out there, so we had to do our work in the fields, erecting antennas, getting our equipment we had all sorts, I'll talk about the antennas in a minute, but we did have to work out there in the fields with the cows and the Brahma bulls and such animals as that. We were putting up communications antennas with sites like Port Lyote, North Africa, Athens and Ankara circuits. We had a circuit to Munich, Germany, and we were doing mostly teletype transmission, and that was even new to me, but we learned, and I got to be quite a teletype repairman too, and I even maintained that into a hobby after I got out of the service. I got to be pretty handy with teletype equipment. And so I had wonderful training, and the transmitters room that we had 20 transmitters. We maintained those for teletype communications and a couple voice communication systems. I'm trying to think, we had to learn to have our motor generators all primed and ready for an event of power failures. We had motor generators that powered up our sites and most of the communications that went through our transmitter site were in crypto, or encrypted messages. We'd watch our teletype messages. We could read our teletype on the teletype machines, and it was very unreadable. It was just gobbledygook, and then that went on to our headquarters in downtown Naples. Now, downtown Naples did have a great large group of NATO officers and whatnot. The headquarters was called HAFC, Headquarters Allied Forces Southern Europe, and that's the group that we were assigned to. My only Navy attachment was that I had to take my records to a building in downtown Naples that held all the records for Navy guys, and if I had to do anything that was related to the Navy, I had to go to this building, but everything else was just NATO. We had our own bases in Bagnoli. We had the movie houses, we had chapels, and it was quite a base. All of Naples was pretty much U.S. Navy. We even had Navy buses that ran all throughout Naples, Italy. We'd had a commissary on the east side of Naples, so we could get food and equipment from the commissaries on the east side of Naples and just get on the Navy bus. You just go out and flag down a Navy bus, and so the Navy had pretty much control of everything that was going on throughout Naples area. So, and we still just had a little residual from World War II. I was there in 1953. And let's face it, the war had just been over in 45, so everybody still called us G.I. Joes over there. We were still had a little bit of, there was still some destruction around from World War II. I did manage to take my spouse with me to Italy, and we lived in a little town called Lucrino between Naples and our transmitter site. And we lived on the side of a volcano. Actually, in the backyard of our home was a mountain, and we could walk to the top and see the actual conical volcano, and at the bottom of this volcano hole, they were farming the fields. Just you look down there and see the farmers farming in the bottom of that hole. So that was interesting that we were in, and that was called Monte Nuovo, and it was just outside of the town of Pozzuoli. So my whole Navy communications, it just sort of was my history. I'd learned it in that Navy electronics school and my Navy repair. And then I just about learned almost all of the Army equipment, Army teletype, Army antennas. I learned to climb telephone poles. I spent days at the top of telephone poles stringing transmission lines and putting up these antennas, rhombic antennas that were large, 40-foot towers or 50-foot towers. We put up some 75-foot towers for VHF communications. We had VHF communications throughout our area. The VHF would communicate from our site to the receiver site to Bagnoli to the headquarters in downtown, and even as far as the commissary. So we'd have VHF and an airport in Naples. So I learned to be quite versed in the communications. That stayed with me in my subsequent years when I got into Purdue, and I've even learned to get into ham radio subsequent to that. So.
All this equipment they had at NATO, that was so they could communicate all over the world now.
That's right. That was mostly all Army equipment. When I first got to our transmitter site, it was Quonset huts, and I learned the things about BC 610s and these radio equipments that I had never seen. I said, look at this, these radios made in Farnsworth Electronics in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Sure.
And so I was learning all new sorts of things, and these equipments were still the BC 610s, and these receivers were running teletype equipment.
Fort Wayne contributed a lot during World War II.
That's right, it
Yes,
did.
it did.
So yeah, that was interesting to see the Farnsworth Electronics, and then subsequently I ended up working at Farnsworth for nearly 30 years here in Fort Wayne after I got out of the Navy, and graduated from Purdue. So that's where I spent most of my years. But anyhow, that was my NATO. We learned, I guess, putting up those transmission lines and those antennas in the fields over there. Driving those 2.5-ton trucks out over the fields. I got a couple of those trucks stuck. You wouldn't think you could stick a 2.5-ton truck. They could just about go through anything. We'd get them out over those fields and they'd go through the ditches. But I stuck one time, and I remember the word was, if you want to get a truck stuck, get Harvey to drive it. So, yeah, that's sort of the history. Any things you want? Any other questions here?
Well, obviously the government decided that you was going to be a radio man, communications, and that's where they sent you.
And well, there was a little incidental story that I enjoyed. We had a general that came down to our site inspecting the NATO all over the whole Naples area, but they came to our transmitter site, a contingent of officers with a general. And our officer in charge at our transmitter site, our officer in charge was an Army first lieutenant. Our assistant officer was a Navy chief warrant officer. Then we had a sergeant first class who was, I think, the head NCO, and we had a Navy chief out there, and then I was a second class. I got to be second class petty officer in electronics. I was an old ET, and fortunately, the ETs got promoted pretty well because they couldn't keep them in the service. ETs would always get out of service quick.
Well, industry was looking for them.
That's right,
Yeah.
and the Navy recognized that as a problem because they were training these guys, and they always said, "Well, we're training you for your electronic service when you're going to be getting out," and that's what they did. My first job after getting out of the Navy was I went over and knocked on the door at Farnsworth and was immediately taken on even before I went to Purdue. So I was a technician at Farnsworth for a while.
Because of your experience. you
That's
had
right.
with
Now, I was going
Sure.
to tell you about this story. When the general arrived at this site, our officer in charge says, well, now, what am I going to do? I got all you military guys, going to align you by height. So we had Army, Navy, Air Force guys, about an equal distribution of all lined up by height. And I remember when that general walked in and he looked at this crew of guys and he laughed because here was every military uniform that you could think of and lined by height. And he says, well, one thing I can see here is your site is overrated, because NATO, when they requested military electronics guys, you didn't become a military electronics until you had a rating. You know, you were either third class petty officer or second class petty officer. So we didn't have too many privates or private first class or Navy seaman recruits or anything over there.
They got their promotions pretty quick then. is what
Well,
you're
that's
saying.
right. So we actually had to do a lot of the digging. Even though I was second class, we were out there digging lots of holes for our the guy anchors for our control towers. I think we had about 70 towers that we put up over in the.
Yeah,
in
irregardless of
farm
the rank, the work still had to be done.
That's right. It still had to be done, and we even had Navy commanders and driving out, and we had one down in our holes with us, helping us dig, putting these guy anchors down for our control towers.
Sure.
So yeah, we had good communications. We maintained those communications with Port Lyote on Saturdays. I could talk to the guys in Port Lyote, and they could communicate and tie us into Washington, D.C. So I could actually sit on a Saturday morning and talk to somebody in Washington, D.C. from our little communications site.
Yeah.
When you was chosen to go to Italy, did the whole group go, or
No,
Just
I was
single.
it. I mean, I didn't get together with other guys going to Italy until I got to the receiving station in Washington, D.C. And there were about half a dozen of us going to that Naples assignment then.
Did you have to take a one-day aptitude test when you was in training, basic training, or
One day aptitude.
no?
In
the ar-
basic training, I had to take.
maybe in
In
advanced-
basic, I had to take the GCT battery test. Is that what you're talking about now?
I was Army, so I'm not
Okay,
familiar.
well, we had to take GCT test. It was, and I can't even tell you what GC, but it was math, mechanical, and there was a one for, I'm trying to think, literary reading and that sort of thing. We had the battery of 3 tests, and I did quite well in all of those. That's one reason why I got into electronics school.
That's what I was going to say. That's what headed you in that direction.
That's right. Yeah,
Uh,
I think I was in the 90th percentile in math and mechanical both, and that got me into electronics school.
Sure.
I did have to request it. I actually got my officers in charge of a mess hall where I was assigned there for a period of time knew of my interest, and they said, well, you've got these GCTs and you qualify for that, and they requested that service for me. And
I was going to say, so they recommended it
and
to
I
you.
got that on a January after 1 year in. So, and then it was a 9-month school. So I went in 51 in January, and I went into electronics school in January of 52, and 9 months there. And then, so electronics has been with me ever since then. I still have lots of ham radio. Ham radio has kind of become a passé problem nowadays because communications is now all with our computers. We
Yeah.
you can sit there and use your Skype and
Yeah,
and
exactly.
AIM and communicate with just about anybody you want now. But I still do like ham radio. We can talk around the world. I have a 70-foot tower in my backyard that I can talk.
You talk through a relay system, is that it, or?
Well, no.
You talk
from
direct-
my
direct?
antenna, I can talk to Australia or Africa or just about
that
anywhere.
would be nicer than email.
Oh yeah,
Talk-
yeah.
talking.
It is. It's fun. It's just that I can't talk to my son in San Francisco, or I have a son in Los Angeles, Garden Grove area. And I did talk to a neighbor of his by ham radio at one time, but now I can talk to him by Skype, visual to visual, so.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, interference plays a lot in the radios.
Well, yeah, you can bet. You oftentimes, even when in Italy, working on that teletype, I worked on some teletype multiplex equipment where, I don't know whether you know, teletype works by a series of 1-0 communications,
Yeah.
and this multiplex equipment would divide those into 1/4. And you could get, in the same periods of time, you could get 4 channels if you had clean communications. But if you start getting noise or atmospheric noise or any of that sort, and it starts interfering, then you couldn't use 4 channels because you couldn't get your data in 1/4. You might get more noise, so then you could go to 3 channels or a 2 channel, or sometimes you could get interference that you couldn't even get any communications.
Yeah.
We'd get the interference from your sunspots. I'm sure you've heard
Sure.
about all the sunspot interference in communications, and so radio is fairly reliable on the HF, high frequency bands, but even then there's a lot of atmospheric interference.
Mhm.
So then subsequent to that experience, I got into more radio communications through ITT after I got out of Purdue, and I did air traffic control communications at ITT. I was assigned equipment called JUMP equipment, called Joint UHF Modernization Program, and we got our ITT equipment in every airport in our country, Air Force and commercial. We had our equipment at Bearfield here in Fort Wayne, and we'd maintain the Bearfield equipment just for them often. I was in the control tower out there to see if one of our equipment wasn't working. And then because I worked for ITT, which was originally Farnsworth Electronics and then became ITT, ITT stood for me, I travel and talk. And so we sold our air traffic control to Turkey, Egypt. I was in Turkey, I've been in Egypt, Pakistan, I've been in the Central America, and I was even in Africa with some of our equipment. We were talking MiGs in Egypt. Egypt had a lot of MiGs, and we had to make our air traffic control radios work with the MiGs.
That's the Russian stuff.
And that was Russian equipment. Egypt had a lot of Russian MiGs, and we had a little trouble with our ITT communications to those MiGs. I was assigned always to go over there and maintain that equipment or tell them work with our government. I'd be assigned to a group in headquarters of the Air Force in Egypt, and how come your equipment can't talk to our MiGs?
Hary, wind it up.
Okay, MiGs equipment drifts.
Oh.
And because it drifts and our equipment was dead on, it couldn't maintain
one
the
side or the other.
communications.
Okay.
So, okay, well, yeah, that's my history of electronics.
Well,
there.
thanks,
Very
Hary, for being our guest. So, remember, freedom is not free. So if you see a veteran or someone in uniform, just walk up to them, shake their hand, and say thank you for your service. Thank you and good night.